crushed, squeezed, because incomes are down. At the same time, gasoline prices are up, food prices are up, health insurance premiums are up. It's really tough being middle class, even if you have a job in America. And so we're going to go to work to create more jobs and more take-home pay. That is our passion. That's why we're in this race. We need a strong America so that we can provide for our families and for the future of this great country.
Watch and engage Monday as President Obama and Mitt Romney meet in their final debate, moderated by CBS's Bob Schieffer from Lynn University in Boca Raton, Florida. Our debate preview starts at 7 p.m. Eastern, followed by the debate at 9, and your reaction at 10:30. All live on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Radio, and online at cspan.org.
Now a discussion about Syria's civil war, which has caused the deaths of over 30,000 people. Foreign policy analysts at the Heritage Foundation examined Russia's role in the conflict and their support of the Assad regime. This is an hour and a half.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here at the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website, as well as those joining us via C-SPAN today and in the future. We would ask everyone in-house to make sure your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin for everyone's benefit in the recording of today's program. We will post the program in 24 hours on our Heritage website for everyone's future reference. Hosting our discussion today is Dr. Stephen Bucci. Dr. Bucci is Senior Research Fellow for Defense and Homeland Security in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. His focus is special operations and cybersecurity, as well as defense support to civil authorities. Dr. Bucci served America for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He commanded the 3rd Battalion, 5th Special Forces. He also became military assistant to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld in July 2001 and served throughout the Secretary's term. At his retirement, he then continued at the Pentagon as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and America's Security Affairs. Prior to joining us here, he was a lead consultant to IBM on cybersecurity. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Stephen Bucci. Steve?
Well, we want to welcome everyone here to Heritage this morning. We have a very timely subject to discuss, and I think we have a great panel of experts that will be doing the discussing, at least to get us started. I have to tell you I have an interest in this because one of the first things I did when I arrived at Heritage was to go testify before Congress about the weapons of mass destruction threat that Syria and its somewhat untimely demise, let's say, might pose. And I am very interested to hear the answer to one of the questions I was asked by one of the congressmen, which was, well, gee, couldn't Russia help us in this regard? I won't tell you what my answer was, but I'm interested to hear what the experts have to say. And we have 3 of them here. The 4th one is en route and should be here by the time it's his turn to speak. But we're going to start with our panelists. They're going to get about 10 minutes apiece to give an initial opening statement. Then we're going to try and get to as much Q&A as we can, and we'll then give each one of them a minute or 2 to do a short wrap-up. I will tell you, for those of you that have not been to panels that I have moderated before, when you ask a question, if you get past the second piece of English language and I don't hear a question mark, I'm going to stop you. So this is not a time for the audience to give speeches. We have 4 experts up here to give those. So to make sure we get as many questions asked and answered as possible, just try and keep your questions succinct, get to the question part, and we'll let the experts address them. But now we're ready to start. I'm going to do all the introductions right away, and then we'll just go down the line. The speakers are sitting in the order which they will present. We're going to start with Dr. Jim Phillips, who's our Senior Research Fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs here at the Heritage Foundation. He has written extensively about the Middle East and international terrorism since 1978. He's a member of the Board of Editors of Middle East Quarterly, and Jim has been interviewed frequently on numerous media outlets and has written for quite a few of the major U.S. newspapers in the area, or in these areas of his expertise. He is an extremely knowledgeable man who has seen things happen and comments on them in my humble opinion, in a very reasonable and accurate way. He'll be followed by Dr. Robert O. Friedman, who is the Peggy Meyerhoff Pearlstone Professor of Political Science at Baltimore Hebrew University and visiting Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. He has been a consultant to both the U.S. Department of State and the Central Intelligence Agency, and he is the author of 4 books on Soviet foreign policy, and is also has been the editor of 14 books on Israel and Middle Eastern policy. And then our third speaker will be Dr. Stephen Blank. He is the Strategic Study Institute's expert on Soviet bloc and post-Soviet world since 1989. He is the editor of Imperial Decline, Russia's Changing Position in Asia, and co-editor of The Soviet Military in the Future. And the last speaker is Dr. Ariel Cohen, my colleague here at Heritage, who is the Senior Research Fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Ariel has often been called upon to testify on Russian and former Soviet politics, economics, and law before the U.S. Congress, and regularly provides commentary on these issues through numerous media outlets, both domestically and across the globe. So I believe we have the right people here to discuss the topic, which I didn't come up with the title, so I can say it's clever and not feel disingenuous. How Russia helps Assad as the U.S. fiddles. And we'll start with Jim Phillips.
Thanks, Steve. I'd like to set the stage for our next 3 speakers, who will focus primarily on Russian policy by briefly outlining U.S. policy and how it's factored into the blood path we see in Syria today, with more than 30,000 dead and no end in sight. From the beginning, I think it's fair to say that the Obama administration was behind the curve on following events in Syria. In part, I think this was because of ideological baggage it carried when it entered office, which led to wishful thinking about the supposed benefits of engaging the Assad regime. In part, I think it was a horrible misreading of the nature of the Assad regime and the possibility of negotiating a diplomatic transition to a new government. And I think in part it was due to an insistence on multilateralism, almost as an end in itself, which hamstrung U.S. policy and pushed decision-making to the United Nations, which was paralyzed by a lack of consensus and the threat of a Russian and Chinese veto. The Obama administration entered office determined to improve relations with the Assad regime and initially soft-pedaled its criticism of the regime's hostile policies, including its violent crackdown on its own people. It did this despite the Assad regime's deep-rooted hostility to U.S. policy in the Middle East, its long-standing support of terrorism, second only to Iran, its implacable hostility to Israel, and its close alliance with Iran and Russia, and before that the Soviet Union. Syria supported groups killing U.S. troops in Iraq and supported Hezbollah, the Lebanese terrorist organization which was responsible for the death of many Americans in Lebanon, including 1983 bombings of the U.S. Embassy and the Marine barracks in Beirut. And I go back to Lebanon because I think it's worth noting that the Marine initially had been deployed there to separate Israel and the PLO following the 1982 Lebanon war, but they were called back following the assassination of Lebanese President-elect Bashir Gemayel, who was assassinated by a pro-Syrian group. Fast forward to 2005, and there was an assassination of another Lebanese leader, this time former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri, who courageously had stood up to Syrian domination inside Lebanon, and that led the Bush administration to withdraw the U.S. ambassador to Syria, because Syria once again had been implicated in the assassination of a Lebanese leader. Despite the Assad regime's bloody track record, the administration sought to improve relations with Damascus and used Senator John Kerry as an intermediary to thaw relations. It reversed the Bush administration's attempt to mobilize international pressure against the Assad regime, and it reversed the decision to withdraw the U.S. ambassador. When the Democratic-controlled Senate balked at approving a new U.S. ambassador to Syria, the administration made an end run by naming Robert Ford as ambassador while Congress was in recess in December 2010. And although Ford later performed ably in demonstrating solidarity with Syria's opposition, as peaceful demonstrators, he could have done that in a different diplomatic position. Didn't necessarily have to be an ambassador. Unfortunately, sending an ambassador back to Damascus when the Assad regime had not modified its hostile policies, sent a message that Washington was eager to restore relations despite Syria's continued role as a spoiler in the Middle East. And this also hinted that there will be little price to be paid for future hostile acts. One of the principal motivations for the administration's glossing over Syria's long-standing enmity was the hope to draw Damascus into peace negotiations with Israel. And this has been a pattern followed by other administrations. The comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace is the holy grail of the American presidency, and other administrations have pursued that and softened U.S. policy on Syria in pursuit of an Israeli-Syria peace treaty. Particularly the Clinton administration, which dispatched Secretary of State Warren Christopher to Damascus more than 20 times, which was more than he went to Moscow or Beijing. But these and other efforts to broker a Syrian-Israeli peace failed because Damascus was interested in participating in a peace process, but not in actually signing a peace treaty. And it was interested in the process because that would diffuse international pressure against it, going back in the 90s when it lost its Soviet ally, and it would allow it to reap the benefits of participating in a process without paying the cost of signing a peace treaty with Israel, which would jeopardize its claim to leadership in the Arab world, the resistance axis, as well as expose it to political vulnerabilities at home where it faced opposition from the Muslim Brotherhood, which was adamantly opposed to peace with Israel. In any case, the Obama administration's engagement policy failed in Syria, just as it has failed in Iran. In both cases, wishful thinking about drawing a hostile regime into a grand bargain or a diplomatic settlement of outstanding issues proved to be unfounded and yielded few tangible results. But in its eagerness to negotiate a deal with both regimes, the administration pulled its punches and initially muted its criticism of the bloody repression that these regimes meted out to opposition movements. And we saw this in Iran in June 2009, when the administration took days, if not weeks, to really toughen its rhetoric on the suppression of the Green Movement. And when peaceful protests erupted in Syria in March 2011, the Assad regime responded with brute force, including indiscriminate shelling by artillery and tanks and airstrikes. But the administration continued to treat the Syrian regime with kid gloves. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton went so far as to describe Bashar al-Assad as a reformer in a March 27th statement. And this was an embarrassing misreading of the situation in Syria. And although Assad had promised to promote reform following the death of his father in 2000, he's done precious little to deliver on those promises. In July 2011, the Assad regime showed its contempt for U.S. policy by orchestrating a mob attack on the U.S. embassy in Damascus, and these and other threats led to the eventual withdrawal of the U.S. ambassador for his own protection. The administration imposed 3 rounds of incrementally escalating sanctions before President Obama finally called for Assad to step down in August 2011. When it became clear that this naive approach to Assad had failed, the administration outsourced its Syria policy to the United Nations, where Russia easily could block effective action. The administration opted to support the Annan peace plan, which was doomed to fail as soon as it was put in place in last April. No outside force is capable of imposing a peace in Syria as long as the power struggle, a struggle to the death, I think, continues to intensify between the Assad regime and the many opposition groups it has spawned. Annan's initiative provided the illusion of progress in resolving Syria's increasingly bloody conflict, but did little to slow Assad's killing machine. The UN observer mission was ludicrously tiny initially, and this was at Russia's insistence. Initially, there were only 40 observers deployed in a country that is bigger than the state of North Dakota. This diplomatic charade benefited Assad by buying time for his thugs to crush the rebellion, and benefited Russia and Iran by helping them to salvage a brutal Middle East ally. But it did little to protect Syria's suffering people. And it does nothing to advance U.S. national interests by ridding the Middle East of a major regime, a state sponsor of terrorism. Without American leadership, the international community often amounts to little more than an empty euphemism on many critical issues, and we're seeing that today in Syria. Russia, China, and Iran continue to support the Assad dictatorship. Tehran has propped Assad up by sending arms, deploying Revolutionary Guards from the elite Quds force to advise and assist Syrian security forces in repressing the opposition. The Quds force is electronically tracking down and helping the Syrian security forces to arrest these opposition leaders. It's training a militia similar to the Basij in Iran, which was instrumental in repressing Iran's Green Movement in 2009, although I think we haven't heard the last of the Green Movement. I think the bottom line is that the Obama administration must abandon its wishful thinking about the nature of the Assad regime, about the effectiveness of the United Nations, and about the supposed benefits of this reset with Russia, if it is to successfully address what's going on inside Syria. Its timid Syria policy is especially grating when compared to its policy on Egypt. And there, the administration pressed for Hosni Mubarak to resign in a matter of weeks, despite the fact that he was a longtime ally, but it took the administration 5 months to issue similar calls for the resignation of Assad. And I think that a country that gains a reputation for quickly abandoning its friends while courting its enemies inevitably will find that it has more enemies and less friends. And unfortunately, I think this is likely to be one of the lasting legacies of the Obama administration in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank the Heritage Foundation, Ariel, especially for inviting me here. And it's a pleasure to be here with Jim and Steve and Ariel on the platform. I have only 12 minutes, as I was promised, and I have a lot to cover, so I'll speak quickly. If there are any questions afterwards, please pick them up. I have 7 parts to the presentation. First, a historical look at both Soviet and Russian relations with Syria, which go back to 1946, before Putin. Look at Putin's policies 2005 to 2010, before the Arab Spring. Then, number 3, look at Russia's concern with the Arab Spring. Then number 4, most important, look at Russia's considerations in dealing with Syria during the crisis. For number 5, I'm going to deal with the cost to Russia of its Syrian policy, which I see as quite large. Number 6, try to explain why Russia perseveres in what seems to be a counterproductive policy, and finally draw some conclusions. In any case, the Russian-Syrian relation goes back a long way. In 1946, after Syria became independent from France, Moscow established an embassy in Damascus, and it became a major center of Soviet diplomatic activity in the Middle East, and was the center point for negotiations between the Zionist movement and the Soviet Union, leading up to Soviet support for the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948. Following the death of Stalin and a series of coups in Damascus, Syria became a purchaser of Soviet arms in the 1950s, and some in the U.S. at the time feared that Syria was, quote, going communist. The Egyptian-Syrian Union into the United Arab Republic in 1958 ended those fears, but it was not warmly received in Moscow, which at the time called Nasser, Egypt's leader, a hot-headed young man for doing it. However, when the UAR broke up in 1961, Moscow again courted Damascus, and following the left-wing Ba'athist coup in 1966, relations became quite close, and you'll recall that Soviet efforts to preserve the narrowly based Syrian Ba'athist regime became one of the causes for the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Relations grew closer in 1970 following the coup that brought Hafez al-Assad to power. Syria granted Russia a naval installation, supply and maintenance facility at Tartus, and the two countries signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation. By 1974, as Egypt began to move into the U.S. orbit, Syria emerged as Moscow's #1 Arab ally. That is not to say that there were no problems between the two sides. A Syrian intervention in Lebanon in 1975 and 76 clearly displeased Moscow, as did its refusal to accept UN Security Council Resolution 242. Nonetheless, Syria is one of the few Arab states that supported the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 and was richly rewarded with military aid as a result. The close relationship continued until the advent of Gorbachev in 1985, who turned off the tap of military aid and urged Hafez al-Assad to settle his dispute with Israel politically and not by war. The chill in the relationship continued until 2005, when a combination of increasing Syrian isolation due to the policies in Lebanon that Jim mentioned, and a much more aggressive Russian foreign policy under Putin reestablished the close Russian-Syrian relationship that we see today. Now let's look at Putin's policies in the second term. I see as reacting to serious setbacks such as the mishandled school rescue fiasco in Beslan and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and at the same time noting the increasing vulnerability of the U.S. in the Middle East because of its invasion of Iraq, which alienated the Gulf Arab states, especially Saudi Arabia, as well as Turkey, and because of the revival of the Taliban in Afghanistan, Putin went on the offensive. It took several steps. First, he tried to improve relations with the rogue states and groups such as Iran, Syria, Hamas, and Hezbollah, as well as Turkey. In the case of Syria, $9.8 billion of the $13.4 billion Soviet-era debt was forgiven, and Putin authorized new weapon sales. And Syria, in return, was one of the few states in the world to support Russia in its invasion of Georgia in 2008. The second step of Putin's policy occurred in 2007. With the U.S. still in disarray in the Middle East, Moscow moved to try to expand its influence from the rogue states to cultivate the leading Sunni Arab states, such as Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Jordan, and in 2008 added Libya to Moscow's expanding arc of activity. Putin's goals in this effort were fourfold. Number one, demonstrate that Russia was again a major power in the Middle East and the world. Number two, gain Arab investment for major Russian industrial projects while selling sophisticated products like nuclear reactors and railway systems. Number three, as the cost and difficulty of extracting Russian oil and natural gas grew, to gain joint ventures in oil and natural gas extraction with countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, the UAE, Libya, and Iraq. And number four, and certainly very important, to prevent the Arab states from aiding the Islamic resistance movements in the North Caucasus that were beginning to spread through the rest of Russia. But keeping good ties with both the Sunni alignment of the Sunni Gulf states, Egypt and Jordan, and the Shia group of Iran's Alawite-led Syria and Hezbollah was not easy, especially as tensions rose between the two groups. This was to be increasingly clear with the onset of the Arab Spring. Now, when you look initially at Russian concerns with the Arab Spring, A, it could spread to Russia, which suffered some of the same problems as the Arab states. Autocratic government, widespread corruption, rising prices. Indeed, some of the democracy demonstrators were shouting, "The revolutionary train stopped at the station in Cairo, next stop Moscow." Second concern, Islamists might take over in the chaos and further inspire the Islamists in North Caucasus and increasingly in Kazan as well. Number three, its oil and gas investments in the Middle East could be jeopardized, as well as business and arms sales deals. And number four, when Libya occurred, the Russians, I think, took a major lesson. They abstained on the UN Security Council vote on the no-fly zone in Libya, thereby supporting the Arab consensus and therefore continuing the widened Russian policy. But, as the Russians see it, this boomeranged badly, as a no-fly zone became a case of regime change, and Russia lost almost $4 billion in arms sales and several $billion in industrial contracts. Now here we come to the main point. Why are the Russians doing what they're doing in Syria? And a number of points. Number one, no repeat of the Libyan experience where Russia lost militarily and economically. We won't permit regime change. Number two, Syria remains an important country in the Middle East, ties to Iran, Hezbollah, and much less so now to Hamas. I think the Russians don't want to alienate Iran, Syria's main ally, who's already angry because of Russia's 2010 sanctions, vote against it under Medvedev. Number three, Russia is a major market for Russian arms. One estimate has at $5.5 billion anti-ship missiles and especially air defense. Number four, the naval facility at Tartus. While it is mostly floating docks and several warehouses, it's the only facility open to Russia in the Middle East, important symbolic value. And in January, elements of the Russian fleet visited Tartus, literally showing the flag. Number five, Russia has economic investments in Syria totaling almost $20 billion. Number six, and this is a point that my colleague Steve Blank is going to talk about, anti-Americanism. As Jim also mentioned, Syria is a major anti-American force in the Middle East, and Putin will not let this be overthrown. Number seven, Islam. If Islamists take over in Syria, it will have a very negative effect on Russia's Muslim population. Spur Islamist insurrections in the Caucasus and in Kazan. And recently, when Islamists attacked U.S. embassies in Cairo and Tunis and elsewhere, and Ambassador Stevens got killed, the Russians said, see, we told you this would happen if you back the revolutions. And finally, number eight, with street demonstrations in Moscow in December of 2011 in the midst of Russia's presidential campaign, Putin asserted that he saw, quote, the same forces at work in Russia as in Syria, and that the U.S. was trying to do an orange revolution in Russia. Okay, Russia then, in summing up, has vetoed 3 Security Council resolutions, including watered-down ones criticizing Syria, continues to ship arms to Syria, saying there is no UN Security Council resolution against arms shipments. However, it's periodically met with Syrian opposition leaders, urging them to open up a dialogue with the Assad regime, and has supported the ill-fated Kofi Annan mission, as again Jim mentioned, just to prolong the life of the regime. Now, what are the costs of this policy? A, alienating the Syrian-led arc of states Moscow has been wooing since 2007, especially Saudi Arabia and Qatar. 2, alienating key Islamic leaders such as Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who called for the boycotting of products of Russia and several days ago said, and I quote, Russian jets are bombing the Syrian people. The Arab and Islamic world must stand against Russia. We must boycott Russia. We must consider Russia our number one enemy. Number 3, it angers and alienates the United States. And number 4, it increasingly alienates Turkey, whose Erdogan regime has been backing the rebels. Now, why is Russia doing this? A, there's continued disunity in the ranks of the rebels, although as of this morning, reportedly, there's another chance, they say, to reunify. They hopefully, Moscow may think they won't be able to oust Assad. Number 2, the U.S., the EU, and Turkey have not, at least not yet, been willing to extend their anti-Syrian rhetoric. However, Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan is quite headstrong. If he continues to be provoked by Syrian shelling and the influx of refugees, he may take action. This is why in recent days, following the shelling and Turkey's forcing down of a Syrian jet flying from Moscow to Damascus, Russia's tried to quiet the situation, and by increasing the supply of natural gas to Turkey, making up for a shortfall from Iran, to maintain the good relations between Russia and Turkey, despite what's happening in Syria. Conclusion. Moscow is taking a major Middle East gamble with its policy in Syria. If the gamble fails, and I think it will, hopefully if the U.S. gets a little more active in the process, Moscow's Middle East policy will be in deep trouble. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Steve?
Thank you very much. I want to thank Ariel and the Heritage Foundation for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be back here again, especially with some old friends. I have to say that my remarks do not reflect the views of the Army, the Defense Department, or the U.S. government, and I'm going to talk about Russian motives, building on what Bob has just said. I think there's some points that can be added to that discussion. The motives that I see operating to drive Russian foreign policy are all simultaneously implicated in the policy. You can't just pull out one string and say, well, that's the decisive factor here in the policy decision-making process in Russia. They're all together. But what we can say, and what we've observed in general about Russian foreign policy in the last several years, not just Syria, is that what we see an increasing narrowing of the policy process in Russia. It has been reported that fewer and fewer people are actually in a key position to make policy in general, not just foreign policy, and that Putin rarely listens to a large circle of people. Instead, he gets his information from a very restricted circle of people. He is not a tech-savvy guy the way Medvedev was. And as a result, and if you have the misfortune to spend your life reading the Russian media as I do, what you see is that Mr. Putin lives in what might be called an echo chamber of paranoids reflecting each other's paranoia and feeding upon it and sending it out. So the Russian belief that the country is under siege, and I use that term advisedly, from a Western effort to undermine the stability of the Russian government and replace it even, and that the allies of the West in this are Russian Democrats, feeds into this. And that's the first point. As Bob mentioned, democracy threatens Russia. As a matter of fact, in 2006, Sergei Ivanov wrote an essay in the Wall Street Journal making clear that democracy was the greatest threat to Russian security, and it still is. There is a profound fear on the part of the government of any manifestation of autonomous political participation by the public in Russia or elsewhere. As Bob pointed out, the Middle East is an example that could spread to Russia, and the Russians know it. Besides Russia, they are quite alarmed, or at least were quite alarmed, that you would see in Central Asia a manifestation of this kind. In April, Deputy Foreign Minister Karasin actually got up and told the Duma that they were quite worried about this and gave the Central Asians advice. And Medvedev, at that time the president, flew down to Uzbekistan to actually work out a strategy with the Uzbek government to suppress any manifestation of what you might call a Central Asian spring. So the first motive here is the profound belief that the Russian government is under threat from democracy, quote, and that democracy, quote, is essentially a Western invention, and that the enemy at home is the enemy abroad. In other words, we still see a government that is addicted to the old Leninist threat paradigm. 20 years after the Cold War, even if Leninism as a philosophy and ideology have gone the way of all flesh, the government in Moscow believes that the internal and external enemies have the common goal of unseating the government through the mechanism of democracy promotion and of the fomenting of revolution. Many of these people cannot believe that the revolutions in the Arab countries were autonomous affairs because their whole experience of politics is that revolution and coups are provocations that are incited by somebody who has something to gain from it, and they naturally project their own paranoia into the system. That's the first motive. Second, there is a widespread and pervasive apprehension among the members of the Russian elite, and it's also many of the members of the analytical faculties that they use, that any revolutionary movement in the Arab world, and for that matter in the Muslim world generally, and that's again including Central Asia, is going to lead to the victory of Islamic terrorists and fanatics. Now, they can point to Libya and say, I told you so. They haven't said much about Tunisia because Tunisia is quiet and it hasn't happened, even though the Islamic Party prevailed in the elections there. But this is their belief that essentially any manifestation of Islamic political assertion is eo ipso terrorist. They can't see it in any other ways, and as a matter of fact, they have brought this upon themselves in the North Caucasus, which is out of control, and as Bob mentioned, is on the verge of spreading into the Russian heartland, Tatarstan. So therefore, what they see in Tripoli, in Benghazi, in Cairo, and in Damascus is that if the authoritarian dictators fall, the only thing coming afterwards is the Islamic fanatic terrorist threat, which will, of course, export itself to Russia. There's all these articles in the Russian press now about Russian Muslims fighting in Syria with the Salafists, or that the foreign governments are supporting Salafists in the North Caucasus, although we never know who these foreign governments are. Nonetheless, you might think there is an international Muslim conspiracy to replace the old international other conspiracies that used to exist in the fevered Soviet imagination, and they actually do believe this stuff. Therefore, their belief is that if Assad goes, naturally Al-Qaeda or somebody like that is going to come in Syria. Second motive. Third, anti-Americanism. Anti-Americanism is a fundamental mainspring of all Russian foreign policy, not just Syria. Two things have to be mentioned here. One, as I mentioned, is the belief that they see themselves under siege from the U.S. and democracy promotion in general. And they see the U.S. and the West carrying out a strategy of democracy promotion through supposed information weapons, information warfare, etc., links with the NGOs, hence all the draconian legislation we've seen, links with the demonstrators, hence the ongoing stream of repressive legislation. Today they just opened the case against Udaltsov, one of the leaders of the opposition. This is part of their worldview. But geopolitically as well, because they are obsessed with the idea that Russia must be a great power in the Middle East, which, by the way, they still see as an area close to their borders, as if 1991 never happened. Their objective in the Middle East is to prevent the United States from having a free hand to consolidate a geopolitical order in the Middle East. That is one of the fundamental reasons behind their support for Iran. There are others, such as their fear of what Iran might do in the Caucasus and Central Asia if Russia was antagonistic to it, the threat of Iranian oil exports to Europe if Iran suddenly became pro-Western, which would undermine Russia's main economic and geopolitical weapon, and so on. Nonetheless, it is essential to Russian geopolitical thinking that Russia must play a role in the Middle East, and that it cannot allow the Middle East to be rendered peaceful strictly by U.S. efforts alone. A continuation of tension, arms sales, running guns. They had a program to run guns to Iran until 2008 when it was exposed. The running of guns and weapons that we've just seen again in Syria. Attempts at gunboat diplomacy in Cyprus against Turkey. Other similar examples show that Russia is determined to play a great power role here through all of the available means and to prevent the United States from consolidating a geopolitical order. And they see the United States as doing so, or attempting to do so, by means of this democracy promotion mechanism and by the unilateral resort to force, bypassing the UN. Of course, the Russians say that the UN must be observed because, after all, it's the only game in town for them. They have a veto power in the Security Council and so forth. But as we all know, when they want to, they disregard the UN and make a mockery of it, as in Georgia in 2008. And as we all know, Mr. Putin admitted that the war was planned 2 years in advance, despite all their claims that they were invoking Article 51 and the right to protect them. So the UN is a facade for them by which they pursue their main geopolitical objectives of squelching democracy and blocking the promotion of U.S. interests and power abroad. Fourth, as I mentioned, they see the U.S. promotion of democracy not only as a threat to Russia, but as singularly uninformed, because they believe that it invariably leads to protracted wars in the Middle East that create an international crisis. They invoke Iraq in this example. They will tell you that Libya is completely out of control, although it doesn't nearly approach what's going on in the North Caucasus, despite the attack on the American consulate in Benghazi last month. They will also tell you that if Assad goes, Islamists will take over, that the alternative is Islamism everywhere, and that therefore the United States really doesn't know what it's doing, and that therefore Assad and the Syrian opponents of his regime have to negotiate. The real fact is that they're never going to support Assad leaving, and they don't want him to leave because the new government that comes in would be anti-Russian. And an anti-Russian government in Syria marginalizes Russia in the Middle East and renders the pursuit of this geopolitical objective quite questionable. It certainly would probably mean, because they're not going to be particularly pro-Shiite in Lebanon, the end of the funneling of Russian weapons to Hamas and Hezbollah, which is a large-scale operation going back at least 6 or 7 years. The Israelis discovered these weapons in 2006 and finally forced the Russians to admit that, well, you know, they might have gotten to somehow. But the fact is they went through Syria, and the Russians knew full well who's the end user of these systems. Fourth reason, then, is this not only fear of Islamism, but also their belief that the United States doesn't know that it's playing with fire. Finally, fifth reason. They have substantial, although not nearly as substantial as used to be the case, energy interests in Syria, and even more arms sales and the naval base at Tartus. Tartus is the only place where the Navy can project power into the Mediterranean, and the Navy clearly wants to do this and has been itching for the opportunity to do so. The Russians have used gunboat diplomacy in Syria by sending the fleet there twice. They used it in Cyprus as well last year to check Turkey. And arms sales. Arms sales in Russian foreign policy are not just a question of selling weapons to friendly states. They are clearly an attempt to create a block of influence for the Russian government within Syria and within the Middle East, the latest one being a $4.2 billion arms sale that was announced to Iraq about a week or 10 days ago. If Iran manages to satisfy Russian apprehensions with regard to IAEA, I would not be surprised to see Russian weapons go back to Iran. They are certainly trying to sell to everybody else in the Middle East. And this is part of their larger strategy of asymmetric support to anti-American movements in the Middle East in order to keep Russia in the game as a great power. Therefore, we have important domestic lobbies that have a stake in the perpetuation of the Assad regime. And more than that, as many of you know, and I've written about this, arms sales in Russia are one of those mechanisms, because the whole sector is thoroughly corrupt, by which slush funds are provided to top government officials for black operations of various kinds, whether at home or abroad. And if they were to lose another $4 billion market, which is what they lost in Libya and what they could lose in Syria, that would put a dent in the graft that is going to the top of the regime. We must never forget that what we are dealing with here is what Moises Naim called in Foreign Affairs in the summer a criminalized regime. If you've read WikiLeaks, it's all over the place. If you read the books by Luke Harding and Ed Lucas and talk to foreign diplomats who will tell you it's a mafia state. It behaves and thinks like a mafia state. And one of the principles of a mafia state is you support your friends when they're in trouble. And Assad is a fit friend for a mafia state. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ariel, would you like to bring it home?
Bring it home and try to connect to U.S. policy. There are different opinions in the analytic community about why Russia is so adamant about the support of Bashar Assad. Yes, of course, it is an historic regime. It's a regime that goes back to the 60s and even the 50s. Russia got along famously well with Ba'ath regimes, be it in Iraq or in Syria, and with the regime in Egypt that was not that different. Basically, quite secular Arab socialist, ultra-nationalist in some cases regimes. These regimes were anti-American, and with the leader of Russia saying that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, clearly having an anti-American regime is a good thing. Some said that this is about Iran. I think the Iranian dimension that we didn't discuss in great detail here is an important dimension. Iran is the strongest Middle Eastern, albeit not an Arab country, but the strongest anti-American Middle Eastern country. It has a relationship that goes back towards the Gorbachev era, when the late Ayatollah Khomeini famously sent a letter to Gorbachev and said, Mr. Gorbachev, he didn't say tear down this wall, he said, the wall fell, your ideology collapsed, now you should all convert to Islam. And there is a memoir and a protocol from the Politburo meeting where Gorbachev mentions that, and the Politburo goes, ha, ha, ha. Nevertheless, Rafsanjani, later the president, then I think the foreign minister, arrives to Moscow and signs first arms transactions with Russia. Russia sold weapons both to their friends in Iraq and to their friends in Iran during the Iraq-Iran war. Felt just great about it. And later on, there is a massive channel of nuclear expertise, hundreds of scientists and engineers, hundreds of the Iranian scientists and engineers being trained in Russia. Unfortunately, many of them were trained also in the West. So Iran is extremely important as a battering ram against American interests and, by implication, the Sunni Arab allies of the United States, as well as against Israel, that is seen as the little Satan to America's great Satan. So as Syria is the principal ally of Iran in Eastern Mediterranean and in Shams, in that part of the Middle East, undermining Syria and giving Iran a bloody nose is, of course, as seen from Moscow, a major priority both for the Sunni Arabs and for the West. Therefore, Russia has to support its Syrian allies, and support it does, including supply of weapons of different kinds, refurbishing of attack helicopters, providing, as we saw with the aircraft that was forced to land in Ankara, as Mr. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister himself, said, the dual-use radar parts. Well, you use these parts to protect Syria from Turkish aircraft, one of which was shot down, and you use it not only to conduct the civilian traffic. A prominent observer of Russian foreign policy, Dmitry Trenin, the head of the Moscow office of Carnegie Endowment, said that it's not only about geopolitics, it's also about geopolitics. And my colleagues did a great job talking about Tartus, the port. There's another port in Latakia that is also used as anchorage and supply base. And by the way, I published a list of Russian aspiration and priorities, including before Gaddafi went, they were thinking about renewing the anchorage in Libya. They were even thinking about going back to the Socotra Island in the Bab el-Mandeb, the entrance to the Red Sea from the south. The island was indeed an important Soviet naval base during the Cold War. So those aspirations of the Russian Navy are known, are still there. Probably we should take them with a grain of salt, because if you look, for example, at the Black Sea Fleet, which would be doing all this, the last ship was commissioned in introduced into service in 1992, and the Black Sea Fleet is not in great shape. So there's a lot of work to be done there. In any event, Trenin is saying that it's not only about geopolitics, it's not only about arms sales, it is about respect. And I don't want to go over the mafia metaphor that Steve just did, but indeed, not just mafiosi, but real powers sometimes crave respect. It's about who makes decisions, says Trenin. If the decision about the use of force in Syria is made without Russia or against Russian opposition, Putin will look at it in a very grave way, just as he and his allies at the time, Herr Schröder and Monsieur Chirac, looked at our decision to use force in Iraq in 2003. And before that, for those who tracked the Russian affairs back then, in 1999, I believe, Mr. Primakov, the then Prime Minister, turned the plane around the Atlantic when the bombing in Serbia started and went back because Russia was not appropriately consulted over the use of force against Milosevic, let alone getting Russian agreement in the UN Security Council. So the issues of sovereignty, the issues of use of force, the issues of agreement, how you use force, are extremely important, not just for Russia, but also for China. In the 3 vetoes in the Security Council, it wasn't just Russia, but also China, who opposed any kind of resolution that may lead to the use of force against the Assad regime. And my colleagues mentioned that Russia abstained in the Security Council on Libya. And that was very important because there was a rare public disagreement between Putin and Medvedev. Medvedev was the president, Putin was the prime minister. Medvedev apparently went along with abstention, saying that Russia should be on the same bandwagon with the West, I don't know if the Arab-Sunni sensitivities were on his mind. And Putin said, no, this is a Western, he used the word crusade, Western crusade against Gaddafi. And we, Russia, should not support it. But because they had this weird, what they call tandem, the separation of the line of work, in which, of course, Medvedev played the second fiddle, but on that particular decision he prevailed. And there was a public rancor about that decision. I personally think that Medvedev was right for a change, because if they did with Libya what they're now doing in Syria, then, and this is one of the main points of my presentation, then Russia would pay a very high price in the Arab world and in the Muslim world by not just standing idly by, but actually aiding and abetting murder of unarmed people in Muslim societies. And here we go to a very important statement by Sheikh Qaradawi, the leading Muslim Brotherhood ideologue that my colleague Professor Friedman mentioned. And when I saw it, I sort of read and reread what the Sheikh said, because the Sheikh commands the loyalty of thousands and thousands of Islamists, and we all know that he was no friend of the United States. He is no friend of the United States. He justified killing of American soldiers in Iraq. He justified killing of Israeli civilians. But now he said, quote, over 30,000 Syrians have been killed. With what weapons were they killed? With Russian weapons. Russia is providing the Syrian regime with weapons and with anything else it needs. The Syrian army is bombing people with airplanes. I do not understand why these planes are not prevented from flying. Why doesn't Security Council prevent these airstrikes? Well, why? Because the Russians and the Chinese vetoed it. These are Russian jets, says Qaradawi. The Arab and Islamic world must stand against Russia. We must boycott Russia. We must consider Russia our number one enemy. I repeat, says Qaradawi, we must consider Russia our number one enemy. It is Russia and China who prevent that, and then he also points the finger on against Iran. So here is the list, the enemy list, for the global Islamist Sunni movement. Russia is enemy number one, Iran and China. This is a major confrontation, ladies and gentlemen. This is no joke. And as Steve and Bob said, we are in an ongoing Sunni insurrection in North Caucasus. It started as a national liberation struggle with primarily secular leadership in Chechnya. The leaders were Soviet generals and colonels like Dudaev and Aslan Maskhadov. And then by 96, that movement was hijacked by Islamists, people like Shamil Basayev and others. And today, the rhetoric, the narrative, the garb, the tactics are all jihadi Islamist tactics. And while I don't agree that it really spilling over into Tatarstan, as my colleagues suggested, because two muftis one was killed and one was severely wounded. And there is Islamization and radicalization in Tatarstan. It is, praise Allah, not there yet. But in places like Dagestan and in Gushetia, this is a day-to-day struggle. It's a slog, and Russian law enforcement and civilians, local civilians, other Muslims, and sheikhs and muftis are killed by the radicals. So Russia has a serious problem on its hands with that. Beyond that, a lot of analysts point out that for Putin and for the Russian government, foreign intervention in a situation where there's an insurgency or even civilian mass protests under the slogans of democracy, foreign intervention in a situation like that is a big taboo. It's a no-no. And that's why they want to support the Syrian regime against this civilian insurrection. And let's not forget, this is in Syria, and we didn't mention that, a minority rule by the Alawite group, by the Alawite sect, if you wish, that is close to Shia, over 80% of the population, which is Sunni. And somehow the Russian leaders and the Russian analysts tend to disregard it or don't give enough weight to that. And I really don't understand how come that little but significant detail is being ignored. I find when I talk to senior Russian officials a woeful misunderstanding, lack of knowledge about the Middle East, about Islam. Repeatedly, top Russian leaders referred to their own terrorists as criminals, and the whole view was these are just bandits or some groups that can be dealt through the prism of crime fighting. That probably reminds some of us, some other people in other countries who are making the same mistake. But what it does, probably there are two main take-home points that I want to make. One is that this clash over Syria changes the dynamics that we saw for the last 20 years in the Middle East. It wasn't so bad. Turkey and Russia were talking to each other. They had a thriving economic relationship. Russia made inroads in many parts of the Middle East, including in the Gulf. They were selling weapons to Sunni Gulf Arab states. Russia improved its relations with Israel. So things were not so bad. Now we are in a situation where these alliances, not formal alliances, but these relationships are unraveling. The relationship between Russia and Turkey, for example, is in its nadir. It's in the lowest point in the last 20 years. So much for Ahmed Davutoglu's declared policy of zero problems with neighbors. Zero problems with Armenia, zero problems with Greece, zero problems with Russia. I'm being sarcastic. Turkey is a hereditary enemy of Russia. There is a history there of over 300 years of incessant wars, and I think both sides need to tread very, very carefully, including in the Caucasus, as to how far this confrontation can go. The Russians, I think, are finding themselves on the wrong side of the large Middle Eastern divide between Shia and Sunni. They're squarely aligned themselves with Syria, and they essentially are the allies and the diplomatic sugar daddies of Iran. And in the long term, when you look at the resources, when you look at the population, it will be the Sunni Arabs who are going to be the prevailing force in this divide. Finally, the relationship with the United States. We heard a lot about the Obama administration pushing the reset button. Of course, the reset was mistranslated. It was billed as перегрузка instead of перезагрузка, overload instead of reset. But the Syrian case, as many other cases, as missile defense and others, demonstrate the depth of fear of the United States, the enmity, and the inability to find common ground. Theoretically, if we recognized the Russian interests in Syria, the specific interests, not the wider geopolitical ideas and fantasies, but yes, there's a $4 billion market for arms in Libya, there's X billion dollars in ongoing arms sales to Syria. Not clear to me who's paying for that, probably the Iranians. There were rather minor petrochemical operation going on wherein Russia was buying petrochemicals from Syria and reselling them. There is the anchorage. So all these things could have been discussed. Instead, what we now have is a continuation, yet another episode of a confrontation that is ongoing between the United States and Russia. But what it demonstrates to us is the enormity of failure of the reset policy. The reset policy did not provide any ability for us and the Russians to resolve ongoing geopolitical conflicts and issues. And unfortunately, the Syrian people, their blood is the price for that. Thank you.